Most of us move at a very frantic pace. And I would imagine that many of us would just say, listen, I feel like a sense of anxiety and just never enough time to be able to get things done. And it feels very frantic in our lives, which is why this episode is so important for us to understand something about God and what He does that will allow us to enter into a space where we can truly experience our soul at rest. Well, everyone, we are now in part 7 in this series, and it's an 8-part series, and so Brad Nelson will be closing us out in the next episode. But when we started this series, we asked the question, if you were to say to a Westerner, what is God like, how would they respond? And we put up all of these different responses about God being good and caring and God being love and holy, and all of that is right and good and accurate. But if you ask somebody from an Eastern culture connected to the biblical world, what is God like? You will get answers like, well, God is a shepherd or living water, a farmer. All of these really concrete images from the culture of their day. And so all throughout this series, we've been looking at the biblical images of God that function in a little bit more of a concrete way in order to go, all right, if God is like this, how does that deepen my relationship with Him? And so in this episode, we are going to tackle the idea of God being a rock or a fortress, because they're always linked in the scriptures, or in most cases. And by the way, a fortress was made out of rock, so you can easily see the connection there. And talking specifically about experiencing God as a rock of refuge. Now, this language of God being a rock is all throughout the Older Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. Let me show you one here from Hannah. After receiving her son Samuel, she composes this prayer where she says, "There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God." And so the sense of God being a rock, God being stable, firm, something that can be depended upon, is how Hannah experienced God and how she associated God being like a rock. Notice how this psalmist puts it in Psalm 71, 1-3. "In you, Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In your righteousness, rescue me and deliver me. Turn your ear to me and save me. Be my," and here's our phrase, "rock of refuge, to which I can always go. Give the command to save me, for you are my rock and my fortress." So you see the language of refuge, rock, fortress, all throughout this Psalm 71. Now, we do not know who wrote this psalm. Most of the psalms will say this is of so-and-so, and many of them were composed by King David. Many people believe this is actually a psalm of David for 2 reasons. One is that the previous 3 psalms are all ascribed to David, and Psalm 71 continues the ideas from the previous 3 psalms. But the other piece of evidence that people will point to is that Psalm 31, which is ascribed to David, has the exact same language. And if you were to go to Psalm 31, you would see all of the connected language to Psalm 71, including rock of refuge, which is what we are centering ourselves around. Now, this is where it gets really fun and fascinating, knowing that David is sitting behind this psalm, is that when he talks about God being a fortress, he uses this Hebrew word, metsudah. Now, metsudah is one of a couple of words that you could have used in Hebrew to describe a fortress. And it's a word that means fortress, but it can also mean stronghold. Now, for those of you who are hearing the word metsudah, some of you are probably thinking, man, that sounds very similar to the word Masada. Exactly. That is where Masada got its name, is because it was a fortress. It was a stronghold. And if we were to go to Masada today, and some of you have been there, you would see this incredible structure with ruins. And this fantastic drone footage is from our friends at biblestock.org, which is just getting ready to release, so check them out here soon. But what you can see here is that Masada is this site that sits way above the valley floor. It's actually 1,300 feet above the floor next to the Dead Sea. And it is a place that is today most often associated with Herod the Great. So for those of you who've been to Israel before, no doubt you probably went to Masada. It's one of the most visited places in the entire land. But this is a really great artist rendering from Balaj Below on what Masada looked like in Herod the Great's day. And typically when people go to Masada, they will learn about what Herod the Great did, but also about the first great Jewish revolt that began in AD 66 and then culminated with the burning of the temple in Jerusalem in 70. But then there was a group of zealots that took up residence at Masada, and the Romans had to come there and basically squelch the last embers of the Jewish revolt. Somewhere in 73 or 74 AD, Masada fell. What most people don't hear when they go to Masada is the possibility that this could actually be a place that David spent time at. And there are a few passages in the scripture that help to lay out this possibility. And it begins in 1 Samuel 22, verse 3, where it says, "From there David went to Mizpah in Moab and said to the king of Moab, 'Would you let my father and mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do for me?'" Now, the context here in 1 Samuel 22 is that David is on the run from King Saul. Now, the capital of the Israelites at this time was actually not in Jerusalem. It was 3 miles north in Gibeah, which is where Saul is from. And we find out in this passage that David is in the Shephelah at a place called Adullam, the cave of Adullam. And from there, he's going to Moab. And the route from Adullam to Moab goes right by Masada. Now, we don't know if David had been to Masada or in that furthest southern part of the Judean desert before. He did raise his sheep or guide the sheep as a shepherd in the Judean wilderness, but it was up much closer to Bethlehem where he would have been. And you just wonder if he's not been there before and he is crossing the Dead Sea at the place called Lisan to get to Moab, if off in the distance he didn't see Moab and mentally note that would be a really great place to go as he is on the run from King Saul. We don't know. But what we do know is that he gets to the king of Moab, and then we read, "So he, David, left them," talking about his parents, "with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him," i.e. the king of Moab, "as long as David was in the stronghold." Now, this is the first time the word stronghold or metsudah shows up. And it's just after David has passed through this area. And so many people, myself included, think that the stronghold here is actually Masada. Now, Masada won't receive the official name Masada until the 1st century BC, but for David, this likely was that stronghold. And if you've ever been to Masada, you'll know that it's not an easy place to get up to. There's only one path that you can get up to. It's called the snake path. I know maybe some of you have actually taken the siege ramp to get up there, but that came in the 1st century AD with the Jewish revolt. Or, which definitely did not exist back in David's day or in Herod the Great's day, a cable car is how you can get up and down from Masada today. But Masada sits at this incredibly strategic place, not only in elevation, but also just where any traffic would have been coming through. And this right here is the Judean wilderness. You've got the Dead Sea over here, and this is Masada sitting right here. You have a commanding view. David and his men could see any movement up in the hills, anything coming from the north or the east or from behind them. It was a place of security for them. And so they went up to the stronghold after leaving the king of Moab. And then the second passage we have about David being in the stronghold is in 1 Samuel 24:22. "So David gave his oath to Saul. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold, went up to Metsudah." Now, the context of this passage is that David has just spared the life of Saul in a cave at En-Gedi. And En-Gedi is a location that we looked at in part 1 of this series when we talked about God being living water. And when you look on a map, Masada is only 10 miles from En-Gedi. And so the fact that they were just at En-Gedi and then they just go up to the stronghold, some of you are thinking, 10 miles, that sounds like a long way to walk. It is for us today, but for them that was a half a day's walk. So a typical day's walk was around 20 miles. And so from a geographical perspective, Masada and En-Gedi are really close together. It would make sense for the text for them to go from En-Gedi to Masada. And then a third passage here, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up in full force to search for him, but David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. He went down to metsudah. Now, context here, David is coming most likely from Hebron. Maybe it's Jerusalem, depending upon how you read this chapter. It's talking about how when David was anointed king, he spent the first 7.5 years ruling in Hebron, and then the next 33 years in Jerusalem. And the chapter seems to be bouncing with timelines there. But it says the Philistines come up and David goes down. And whether he's in Jerusalem or Hebron, he is going down to Masada because they did not think about directionally down being south. They're talking about elevation. And even though Masada sits 1,300 feet above the valley floor, the Dead Sea is the lowest place on earth. Hebron is the highest place in southern Israel, and Jerusalem also sits at a high elevation, not as high as Hebron, but either way you shake it, if David is coming from Jerusalem or Hebron, he's going down, not directionally. Yes, for us in the Western world today, he is going south, he is going down, but he's going down elevation-wise. And he's going to what seems to be Masada. Now, do we know for certain that this is the imagery behind David's fortress? We do not. We know that it had to be a stronghold. We know it had to be a high rock that functioned as a fortress. But here's what's so cool about the archaeological record, is that one of the most famous excavations in all of Israel's history took place in the 1960s by Yigal Yadin, and he and his team excavated Masada, and of course they found a ton of stuff connected to Herod the Great. But in their excavation reports, they indicated that they found pottery, Iron Age pottery, from the 10th century BC, which is during the time of David, which is why many people, myself included, believe that when David is talking about metsudah, it's actually a reference to Masada today, which again got its official title in the 1st century BC, but it's functioning as the rock of refuge for David. And he goes, and that is what God is like in my life. Which is why David will go on and write this: the Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior, you save me from violence. And again, the word fortress here is the word metsudah, David's rock of refuge. Now, if you were to go to the top of Masada today, you can see why David would want to be in this space. Is that when you just look out and you can see so far in the distance, you can see as David is on the run that he found a sense of peace and solace and rest at Masada. And as he is there, knowing that he is high and lifted up on a stable rock, that there was a sense of security, there was a sense of, okay, I can just breathe. And that's the idea, even for us today, of what a refuge looks like. For you, you may say, yeah, I get that idea because your refuge is you have a cabin that is in the woods, or maybe you go and you get to visit occasionally if you don't own it. Or maybe for some of you, it is a cottage on the lake, and you say, when I just show up there, like my soul just settles and I feel at peace. For others of you, maybe it is a high elevation that you hike to or that you drive to, and it's a vista lookout point, and when you go there, you're like, this is my refuge, this is my space. That your soul just feels at rest. for David, that's how he felt at metsudah. That he would go on and he would write in Psalm 62, even though he doesn't use that same word, metsudah uses the other common word for fortress here. It's all the same idea. Truly, my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. And you just go, my soul finds rest, and you go, I long for that. Well, the question for us today is what does it look like for us to be able to experience God as a rock of refuge, to be able to experience that rest in our lives? Because not only did David experience that with God, but people experienced that with Jesus as well. And when we dip into the New Testament space and we begin to see what Jesus is doing and how he's talking, this language of rock and refuge and cornerstone and rest is all throughout his ministry. In fact, in the last episode when Brad talked about God being a master builder, he talked about Jesus being the chief cornerstone. But for our purposes today, I want to take you to a very famous passage that most of you have probably read and probably can recite. Matthew 11:28-30, Jesus says these famous words, "Come to me, all you are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, there's a lot going on in this passage. In fact, we took an entire episode in our Rabbis and Disciples series to tackle just these 3 verses, and so you can check that out at episode 124 at Walking the Text. But the idea here is that Jesus says, I am the one that can give you rest. That Jesus becomes our rock of refuge. And so the question becomes is how can we experience him in this way? For some of you, you go, man, I do have this refuge that I go to, on vacation once a year to this place, and that's great. And some of you are like, I do have that place that I go to once a month. That's great. But how do we make it more frequent? For some of you, you're probably thinking, like Sabbath is a place of refuge. It may not always be in the same location, but the idea of taking a break just allows my soul to experience rest. I know that's true of my life and my family's life. But how can you also make this something that you can visit on an even more regular basis, perhaps even a daily basis? I know for me that it's my home office. And because I do have a big whiteboard that has lots of stuff written on it and papers all over the place and all these to-do lists, I come into my home office in the morning and I've got light-canceling curtains. And typically I'm up before the sun anyway, so it doesn't matter, but I will draw those curtains and I will just create a space of utter darkness so that I can't see anything on my whiteboard. But to be reminded of the presence of God, I light a candle and I just let that little flicker of light remind me of who God is and that he is present and that he wants to do something inside of me. And I find that in the midst of all of the to-do lists and all the emails and all the distractions, like I need this refuge on a daily basis to be able to experience the goodness of God in my life, a God that settles my soul and reminds me of who I am and what really matters. And friends, I believe that we need to be pursuing this kind of a space. And it's not just going to happen out of the blue. You're not just going to fall into a restful space. You have to be intentional. And I would also just say that in the midst of whatever you're going on, whatever your life looks like right now, you can find that space. In fact, I would argue for the sake of your soul, you must find that space. And as you do so, eliminate all the distractions and allow yourself to just sit in the presence of God, to be washed over by his goodness, and just allow all the hecticness that sits in your soul to rest and be at peace, knowing that you are in the space with the living God of the universe who knows what he is doing and he knows what he's doing in your life. And just allow his goodness, his grace, his mercy, his peace just wash over you. And may you experience God as a rock of refuge. So friends, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. As we've done with every episode we've ever created, there are questions that can take you deeper with the content of this episode and every other episode that you can find at Walking the Text. And for now, may you experience God as a rock of refuge, and may you walk out this text well in your life.